Thank you, Alasdair, for giving me the floor. And let me thank again also the organizers to be able to speak to you today. I'm really pleased to give, in this case, the views of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And as you can also see, certainly with my background, FAO has been founded 75 years ago. So we are looking certainly back on some quite a long tradition and also expertise. Let me just start before going into the food safety issues with a bold figure. We still have 690 million hungry people, and the COVID may contribute to an increase of further 120 in the coming year. And the issue of food safety is very closely linked to that, because the COVID has shown that food safety issues have and could have a negative impact on the food systems, and therefore, of course, also on income and therefore increase of poverty. So I think I wanted just to be at the beginning clear that there is a very close linkage also food safety, COVID, and also poverty. But now let me come to some of the points and the aspects. The COVID has really tested the functioning and the resilience of our food system. So when we're talking in this case about the food system, the economic, the social, and the environmental dimension of producing, processing, but of course also consuming foods. The consumer in this case plays, of course, a key role. A key element in our food supply chain is to keep, of course, our food safe, healthy, and to ensure also high quality, to make sure that we're going to have a healthy, nutritious diets for all the consumers. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that there is sufficient access to the local, regional, and the global markets. The early days of the COVID, the trade was interrupted, and it showed really the vulnerability of the supply chains. While COVID is not directly related to food safety issues, this is something which I want really to emphasize. The lockdown and the social distancing measures have really affected food production, food supply chains, and the food markets from the local to the global level. So as a consequence, there have been knock-on impacts on the actions of the food business operators and food safety authorities. But let's, in my short remarks, which I'm doing, look at the effects on food safety and quality control measures. I will follow here a bit the timeline as the issues have evolved since the earlier days of the pandemic. As a general statement, I want to make it very clear, we have seen that there is an increased attention and focus on food safety, and indeed another One Health issue as a result of the pandemic. What we need to take first into consideration is that at the beginning of the pandemic, there was concern that COVID-19 may be transmitted by food. But it became very clear there is no evidence today of the viruses, including the coronavirus, that causes respiratory illnesses being transmitted via the food. So there is no danger of that this is going to be transmitted via food. I want to emphasize that COVID-19 is really not multiplied in food, and it's really highly unlikely that people can contact COVID-19 from food or food packaging. I think this is an important message which I want to pass on to the consumer. Second, another important challenge at the beginning of the pandemic for the food industry was the access to raw materials and ingredients and the labor availability. So as the lockdowns were introduced in many countries, the food businesses had to change suppliers. For example, some of the markets were closed, or also processors were not able to deliver, adapting to food production schedules, or come up with also other innovative solutions. They had to adequately store the final product. So in some cases, they were not able to sell it, so they had to put it on stock. And that, of course, creates then probably food safety issues, not to speak about logistical issues and transportation. So during all these scenarios, a food business needs to take the appropriate measures to assess the risks in order to assure the safety and quality of the food. They had to adapt really also quickly the necessary good hygiene practices. And sometimes as a consumer, I think we are forgetting about this, that what we are getting on a day-to-day basis in our supermarket shelves, that this, of course, has a very high logistical implication. And of course, also the hazard analysis and critical control points procedures, which are in fact done in the processing facilities, they are in the restaurants and in all the parts of the food chain to ensure that there is no compromise on the safety and quality of the product. The third aspect which I wanted to mention here is there is a much more greater awareness of the hygiene and the role it plays in the disease transmission. I think we have been, and this was also the first point, we have been suddenly experienced that consumers became a bit sensitive that it could be transmitted via the food, and therefore the consumers had a much higher attention to food safety issues. So there have been also alternative food markets emerged. The minister was already referring to that. Of course, tourism is a market, but there was also the need to find new, let's say, new channels where they can place their products, because the hotel, restaurant, and the catering business at some time was also closed, and so therefore the demand for local food directly also from small producers, local farms, vegetable boxes increased rapidly, as well as also e-commerce provided an opportunity for the business to overcome the challenges. So all of this certainly requires that the small food businesses, and the minister was talking now about also linking it to tourism, it's important that these businesses are informed on food safety requirements, implement food safety management systems and practices, and also demonstrate the food safety systems as a means to access also new and different market. So the concluding point out of this first phase of the pandemic is that food safety was really an important element, and that international standards to ensure food safety needed to be also in place. If we are moving on, once it was really understood that the production could continue, the next priority became to ensure the safety of the food workers at the production and during the services. So we're talking about hotel, restaurants, catering service, but of course also processing. So importance of following the strict hygiene and protection practices became evident, particularly in the meat processing. We have heard in the last couple of months that several meat processing plants needed to be closed because of infections, and therefore it became very clear that such outbreaks in slaughterhouses can only be prevented if strict hygiene and protection measures are taken in place. So the outbreaks led to, in this case, positively improved working conditions, stricter applications of quality and safety measures, following the guidelines of the competent authorities. I mean, just to mention here some of them, what I think is, again, really important in food processing units is minimizing the possibility of persons to really transmit the COVID in the workplace. Many food producers have been, in the meantime, trained their staff in the production and the personal hygiene, and the daily health checks introduced have been further also improved. Important in the retail sector is here also, again, physical distancing, introducing plexiglass barriers at the tills. We have all experienced this over time, and everyone has had to adapt, including the consumers who started to pay more attention to keep the food safe or to pay attention to it when shopping and handling also the food. I think one important issue that people, also what we have observed, people started to cooking more at home and changed the way also how they bought the food. So more home delivery, online food shopping, as mentioned before, all this requires strong food safety hygiene practices to carry out, and of course, in this case also to be further sensitized. Finally, what I would like to mention, the competent authorities have really a critical role to play during this pandemic in informing also the consumers on the practices to follow, as well as working with the food industry to ensure continued food supply. They are really responsible to protect the consumer's health and also assure fair practices in food trade. So in this case, we need a robust food control system by providing an enabling environment with clear policies on food safety and sufficient inspections and laboratory analysis capacities. And particularly these laboratory analysis capacities is something which is quite important. And it also shows certainly how countries are in a position to maintain the food safety and to implement that. Many countries have also, in this case, moved ahead and established also informative websites and shared also guidelines for food producers, importers, and the catering sector. So there are really more and more competent authorities which had to change also the routine work and the functions, and they had to put more focus on monitoring, surveillance programs, because what you can imagine also as a consumer, normally we have let's say food inspectors going to the restaurants, food inspectors going to processing plants. Now, if you have a lockdown, if you have in principle restriction of movement, this needs to be done much more maybe virtually. So we had to change here also the framework. So the temporary use of electronic submission of food businesses inspection results and relying on their own checks is something which really was brought as a change based on this very specific pandemic. Last, and in concluding, I really would like to mention that the COVID-19 focuses on the livestock human interface risks and showing the importance in this case of biosecurity and hygiene measures to prevent and manage also the food chain risks. So we strongly advocate from an FAO point of view a One Health approach in this regard, and the pandemic has really also affirmed the importance of preventing and mitigating food safety risks and puts the obligation on all of the countries to put in place appropriate systems to protect the human and the animal health. And this is, I think, particularly important in the current environment of self-isolation, quarantine, where really the resilience on safe and efficient food supplies becomes more evident and necessary. So as we build and transform our food systems and ensure resilience to future shocks, the countries need to invest really in food safety and emergency plans, preparedness, and responses as essential. Thank you very much for your attention.